Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, from across the JCU community and beyond. I'd like to welcome you to the second edition of our new Conversations with Alumni series. My name is Jack Growden. I'm the Alumni Relations and Development Coordinator at James Cook University, and I'll be hosting these panel sessions once a month, featuring some of our amazing alumni in discussions about the most pressing matters of our time. I truly look forward to moderating this webinar. However, before we continue, I wish to acknowledge the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first inhabitants of this country, and pay my respects to the traditional owners and elders, past and present, of the land on which we stand today. In the spirit of reconciliation, I also acknowledge the valuable contribution that Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples continue to make to JCU and the broader community. Well, to all of our alumni in the audience, thank you very much for joining us. I was looking through our list of registrants earlier and I was delighted to see people tuning in from India, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Germany, the USA, China, Singapore, Japan, Vietnam, Papua New Guinea, and every state in Australia, highlighting the global span of our alumni community. And much like last month, we certainly have a global audience tonight, befitting a global topic, as we'll be exploring the concerning trend of rising inequalities between nations and between individuals across practically every aspect of human development. And this is a discussion very close to my heart, so I'm thrilled to be joined by a very astute and experienced panel, which we are honoured to have comprising two distinguished alumni and our Vice-Chancellor. As an alumnus of JCU, I'm proud to count myself among the same group as our esteemed panellists who join us this evening. Firstly, I'm delighted to introduce our Vice-Chancellor and President, Professor Sandra Harding AO, who began her journey with JCU in 2007 upon her appointment as Vice-Chancellor. Educated at the Australian National University, the University of Queensland, and North Carolina State University, Sandra is an economic sociologist by training and has a keen interest in public policy related to the global tropics, highlighted by her role as project convener of the State of the Tropics project. Sandra has held positions on more than 30 local, national and international boards throughout her distinguished career, and we are delighted to have her expertise in this conversation this evening. So welcome, Sandra, and thank you for joining us from Brisbane.
Thank you very much.
And Sandra is joined by one of our outstanding alumni Chancellor Award recipients, Dr. Rose Evaster-Aderolili, who graduated from JCU in 1996 with a PhD in economics and a graduate certificate of education. After working as an economist in Uganda and a lecturer in Papua New Guinea, Rose joined the fledgling Cairns campus in 1991 and eventually became the first lecturer in economics. In 2001, she joined the United Nations as an economics affairs officer, eventually being promoted to chief economist at the United Nations mission in Sudan. She has been the chief advisor to the UN as special representative of the Secretary General on humanitarian matters and reconstruction in Sudan, and is also the former chief of the social development program for the UNECA. Wow, what an outstanding career, Rose, and thank you very much for joining us from Melbourne, and welcome.
Thank you, David. The pleasure is mine.
And next we have Professor David Hulme, OBE, who graduated in 1985 with a PhD in geography while working concurrently as a development practitioner in Papua New Guinea. Currently, Professor Hulme is the Executive Director of the Global Development Institute and CEO of the Effective States and Inclusive Development Research Centre. A 30-year career across rural development, poverty reduction and social protection has seen him hold roles within non-government organisations across South Asia, East Africa and the Pacific. He has authored and co-authored 6 books on global development and is a board member of the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development. So welcome, David, from Manchester. It's great to have you with us.
It's great to be able to connect, a great privilege.
Thank you. Now, for the audience, should you have any questions that you'd like any of our 3 panelists to address, please pop them in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen, and we will endeavour to get them answered towards the end of the webinar. Well, we only have an hour to discuss some very poignant topics, so let's get straight into it. Vice-Chancellor, I might start with you, but I would encourage all panellists to jump in should they have any comments throughout the session. So in 2010, you launched the State of the Tropics project, which aimed to establish the tropics as a geopolitical entity in their own right and highlight the increasing importance of the region and the global implications of the immense social, economic and environmental challenges that the tropics are experiencing. We might focus on the social and economic shifts here. Could you name some of the types of inequalities that the 3.3 billion people living in the tropics are experiencing?
Yes, I can, Jack. And if I can say, first off, indeed, my own warm welcome to all of the alumni who are listening in tonight and participating. The idea of the tropics is something that it really goes to the heart of what James Cook University is all about. We were established all those years ago, 50 years ago this year, to be Australia's university for the tropics. And if I can personalise this just for a moment, when I started at James Cook University in 2007 as Vice-Chancellor, it certainly occurred to me that not enough was known about the tropics as a geopolitical entity, really mapping the tropics. And so the notion of trying to give effect to our role as Australia's University for the Tropics to better understand tropical nations and tropical populations seemed to be pretty important. And that's what we've done through this particular project, as well as, of course, the amazing work that so many of our academics have done for so many years. So what we know by virtue of this report is we know now a great deal about the tropics as a zone, as a global zone, in a way that we simply didn't before. And part of that goes to the work that's been done through this project in the delivery of two major reports. One, first of all, in 2014, which was launched by Aung San Suu Kyi, the Nobel laureate, and the follow-up broad brush report, which was launched just this year on the 29th of June, which is the UN-endorsed International Day of the Tropics. And so we know a lot now about the tropical communities with which our university is charged to be involved with and to work for and to support. And here's some of what we know. You mentioned it's 3.3 billion people living in the tropics, and that's quite right. What that is, it's 40% of the world's population. It's 55% of the world's children live in the tropics. And the estimates are that by the 2040s, it'll be something like 2/3 of the world's children will live in the tropics. So when you ask me the question about the tropics and the social and economic shifts there, at one level, it would be easy to say, well, why do we need to worry about that? We need to worry about that because that is where the weight of the world's population is and is going to be going forward. So what do we know as a result of this project? First of all, the good news is that between the 2014 report and the 2020 report, what we know is that while key indicators continue to lag the rest of the world, key economic and social indicators, the region has made extraordinary progress in relatively few years, particularly since the turn of the century. So life expectancy has continued to increase, disease has declined, and more children are in school than ever before. However, our most recent report also showed some worrying outcomes too, some sobering trends. Some of the progress that's been experienced over previous years has begun to slow more recently. Undernourishment has increased and extreme poverty persists. Our estimates suggest that around 35% of people in the tropics live in extreme poverty. And to put that another way, when you think about the weight of the world's population being in the tropics, it's around 85% of the world's extreme poor live in the tropics. The tropics has a much higher disease burden than the rest of the world. The majority of HIV, malaria, and TB cases occur in the tropics. However, again, there's an upside to this. There's an ongoing improvement there in the data that we can see, and a number of countries are on track to eradicate malaria. Some tropical countries are still undergoing epidemiological transition, such that the rates of non-communicable diseases, so diabetes, heart disease, lifestyle diseases, are increasing alongside persistently high rates of infectious disease and undernourishment. And that's a real challenge because the traditional burden of infectious tropical disease and neglected tropical disease is being paralleled with a rise in non-communicable diseases of this type. So that still is unacceptably high, those rates of non-communicable diseases. Youth literacy on the upside is now close to 90%, and adult literacy is just over 80%. So that's good news compared to where we were, even in 2014, but it also demonstrates there's more work to be done. So a range of indicators there, Jack. There is improvement, and that's really the good news. The good news is there is improvement since the last State of the Tropics report, but in critical indicators, the tropics still lags.
Well, thanks very much, Sandra. I think that's a fantastic encapsulation of some of the developmental challenges that not only the tropics face, but also our entire global community. So I will get back to you on some of those sobering trends you mentioned in my next question to you. However, David, I will cross to you now. You've enjoyed a remarkable career as a development practitioner, researcher, and author across the world. Yet I'm sure that I'm sure the nature of your work is as eye-opening as it is rewarding. Could you perhaps point to some examples throughout your career where the gap between affluent and impoverished, rural and urban men and women has been particularly sharp? And have you noticed throughout your lengthy career a widening in these types of inequalities globally?
Yeah, one can see this in many examples. I'll maybe just go through three of them. Let's focus on Bangladesh, one of the countries that the State of the Tropics looks at. I've been working on Bangladesh the last 30 years. Bangladesh has been making incredible progress if you look at the reduction of extreme poverty. Incomes have gone up for many poor people. People are in school, girls are in school, infant mortality's gone down. But if you look at inequality, economic inequality or social inequality, then that has grown incredibly rapidly during this period in which the extremely poor have had some advances. And you see that in a whole number of things. If you simply look at the urban fabric, when you arrive in Dhaka, then there are luxury apartments 20, 30 stories high. But if you look next door to them, then you can see shacks that have no water, no sewerage system, absolutely no services. So you can see how very affluent people are living right next door to people who've got really no services. You see it on the streets, on the roads. When I first started working in Bangladesh 30 years ago, most cars were second-hand Japanese cars. Now when you go along the road, there is a BMW and next to it are 4 or 5 street children who have nowhere to live. And you have a Series 5, a Series 7, whatever the most expensive ones are, next to children who just have nowhere to live. And you see it at even at the micro levels. In a rural area, if you go to a village meeting, then it's almost bound to be men who are sitting around the table, and then a group of men standing around behind them, and then right on the edges, large numbers of women because of gender inequality in the way that women are not expected to speak and go into that. But I think we also need to think closer at home. In the UK, I come from a council estate just outside of Liverpool, and I was able to get a good state education, go to James Cook University and develop a good career that's been very satisfying. When I go back to that estate now, I doubt that the children from that estate will have the opportunities that I have. Our education system, our forms of social mobility have reduced. And I don't think the youngsters there have the opportunities that I had 50, 60 years ago. And that's why in the UK and many other countries, so many people feel left behind. They can't do what was a possibility for people from an earlier generation. And then finally, it's not so vivid, but it is good. Take a look at the data. Take a look at the Oxfam Inequality report. That shows you the way that the world is getting more affluent, but that affluence concentrates in a smaller and smaller number of hands. Manchester, we've been working on this a lot, and we say we live in a world of converging divergence. If you look at the global data, then things appear to be getting much better, particularly for the extreme poor. But when you look at regions and nations, then you find, no, people are having very different lives. Some have extraordinary affluence, some are barely getting by, even in countries that are very well off.
Yeah, thank you, David. I think that last point is just spot on. And I'm really thrilled that you mentioned Bangladesh. Actually, it's a country that faces some of the future's sharpest challenges, such as rising sea levels, and also rising populations. However, it's also been home to some absolutely incredible developmental innovations as well. And I'd urge the audience, if they're not already aware, to check out Muhammad Yunus and his microfinancing initiative known as the Grameen Bank, which he launched. It certainly had an incredible impact. Rose, I'll move over to you now. You spent many years with the United Nations, including as chief economist at the UN mission in Sudan, which I'm really interested to focus on here. As an economist, what have been the implications of economic inequality on Sudan's future? Of course, in 2011, the country split with South Sudan, becoming an independent state. To what extent has a long history of wealth inequality and inequality of opportunity contributed to the civil unrest which continues to plague Sudan and many other nations in the sub-Saharan region today?
Well, thank you very much, Jack, for this question. My stint in Sudan as chief economist was one of the most exciting, but also the most challenging, because it was at a time when Southern Sudan was trying to break away from Sudan as we knew it. And it was a time when the world had pledged about $5 billion for reconstruction of the whole Sudan and for the setting up of the new country. Now, my role was to try and come up with a framework for making use of those funds. It was a massive task. Thank goodness that, Jesse, you had prepared me also very well for hard work. I managed to put together a team of economists from the government, from other stakeholders, from other UN agencies. And Southern Sudan then became an independent state in 2011, as you said, but at a cost of many lives. Millions of lives were lost, internal displacement, refugees all over the world. And since then, it is sad to note that because of this income inequality that continues even in this independent state, there is no peace, there is no security. And without peace and security, without any strong governance, there cannot be any development. And no development means more inequality. That is the Southern Sudan that I went to. However, we all had great hopes, and we still have great hopes, that Southern Sudan can still come up to be a very strong nation, a very strong economy, because of the total oil reserves in the whole of Sudan, 75% of oil reserves are in the south. And not only that, they've got massive arable land that is capable of producing enough food that can feed not only the whole of Sudan, but could also be for the whole of East Africa. But you find that it is other countries that are still feeding Southern Sudan. Most of the food comes from Uganda, comes from Kenya. Most of the population is to be found in those three countries, which is very unfortunate. And another thing that is still continuing to fuel income inequality is the weak governance institutions. Corruption has been a problem that has seen lots of government resources, lots of public resources now diverted to private interests. It is not uncommon to turn on the news about Southern Sudan and you hear about the elite who do not only control the political system, but they control the economic systems as well, as if they are private properties. You hear of them having mansions all over the world, but when you see how the general population is suffering, I think it is quite disheartening. I was telling my daughter the other day that one image that keeps playing in my mind when I think about what is going on in Southern Sudan is when there was an exodus of the population running away from conflicts recently. And there was a little boy of about 3 to 4 years old running with the crowd. And I think he got lost and he was holding only one little duck in his armpit. He would be pushed forward and he would be pushed backwards. Then I asked myself, what is the future of this country? If the population, if people cannot settle down, you have to settle down to be able to produce. You have to settle down to be able to grow your economy. You have to settle down to be able to see the benefits of what is in what the wealth in your country. So Southern Sudan, as long as they don't have peace, there is no security, I think it is going to be a bleak future for the country, which is so rich with all sorts of resources.
Yeah, thank you, Rose. And look, I think that the narrative of Sudan really does highlight the crucial importance of addressing inequality to achieve peace and security. And as you said, a country that's devoid of peace and security will always have long-standing developmental challenges. So very poignant points there. So thank you all for your thoughts on where we stand currently and for identifying some of the many inequalities which are rife across humanity. These certainly are profound challenges which we face as a global society. And so as such, I'd like to steer the conversation now towards how we work towards bridging these inequalities, and also with a rapidly changing world, what other inequalities are emerging? And so let's focus on the latter first. Sandra, I'll start with you. You're currently leading James Cook University through a very difficult chapter for higher education around the world, in which the entire industry is having to shift and adapt to the shift towards digital modes of education and also work with COVID-19 lingering. There's certainly clearly a significant digital divide between the developing and the developed worlds, and certainly within each, with education long heralded as a key catalyst for social mobility and advancement. In your opinion, is the digital divide one of the most pressing inequalities that faces modern society?
The digital divide, Jack, really must be considered incredibly important. It's something that I know a lot of people are looking to track right now, and certainly the State of the Tropics project has tracked it as well. Just to make an opening observation, however, you mentioned about James Cook University, and we're going through, as we all institutions in the world, and actually David and I had a brief chat about this beforehand. All universities are facing really great challenges right now as a result of COVID-19. But you know, our industry isn't the only one. All industries, all people everywhere are having a really tough time with this. And we're working our way through it. And I might say, just from a JCU point of view, knowing that there'll be people interested out there, our staff at JCU have done just a magnificent job of transforming our courseware in a very, very short period of time. Of course, we did have online options, but it was something like 800 subjects in a matter of a few weeks were transformed into online, which was just an extraordinary achievement. So I think it's times like these that people really do pull together. But I was thinking, as a way of getting into this question, Jack, you know, imagine if something like this had happened 20 years ago, how difficult it would be. We wouldn't be here talking with each other at all. And for me, that underscores the significance of the digital revolution of which we're a part, and which is really being turbocharged now, I think, as a result of COVID-19. So your question really does go, though, to education, and that being a key catalyst, and what's the impact of this digital divide on that. And it is compelling, it is important, and it is worrying in some respects. And I might say, you know, to go to our local experience under COVID-19 conditions, with that movement to a lot of our programs being online, we know that there are people in our catchment, you know, people in North Queensland and far North Queensland who simply don't have the bandwidth to be able to sustain the sort of conversation that we're having right now. And as I say, can you imagine if this had happened 10 or 20 years ago? I don't quite know how we'd be managing it. So it isn't just an issue for the tropics, it's an issue for the developed world too, where you have great inequalities in rural, remote and Indigenous communities' access to you know, I guess, the sort of required communications technology that you just got to have these days to get on. But to get to the tropics overall, which was sort of your question here, is that that digital divide was something that we were very keen to measure, and we did measure it in the first report, and we measured it in the second report too. And again, the situation has improved. In the tropics, around 40% of people now use the internet. And my recollection is it was about 19% in the first report. And mobile phone usage, which even then was around the 80% mark, is now almost universal. But interestingly enough, part of what we looked at was, we look at other reports, of course, too, but according to the World Bank, the benefits of that ICT growth, you know, the almost universal mobile technology and 40% of people using the internet, that hasn't had the impact that might have been expected on global productivity, on the expansion of opportunity for the poor and the middle class, and the spread of accountable governance, to go to Rose's point. And I hope we get to talk more about governance later on, because it's so important as a framing, you know, really for our societies, for our economies, and it enables us, or it prevents us. It's a major barrier, as Rose was describing in terms of the Southern Sudan. So what we've found, that accountable governance also, there hasn't been the sort of impact that you would like to see as a result of the improvements to ICT infrastructure. So what we know, and I guess this is not a surprise, that the better educated, well-connected and wealthier amongst us have received most of the benefits from that digital revolution. For example, 85% of the user-generated content indexed by Google comes from North America and Europe, reflecting similar outputs to other knowledge-producing platforms like scientific journals. When data on access to the internet are disaggregated by income, age, gender, and the urban-rural divide, the digital divide becomes even more apparent. The wealthy have more access than the poor, the young have more access than the old, men have more access than women, and city dwellers have more access than people living in rural areas. And I guess my last observation on this digital divide goes to the COVID-19 emergency itself. And as we know, that has turbocharged our engagement with the digital world overall. But it's a very interesting point that was drawn to my attention, that due to this crisis, 190 countries have faced complete or partial school closures as a result. And that means more than 1.7 billion students have been affected, and we don't understand the full impact of that yet. But you've got to imagine that those with access to reliable, consistent technology, high-speed internet in particular, will certainly have an advantage. So I worry now about the world ahead. And my final remark, Jack, is that the last State of the Tropics report, of course, being launched in June this year, the data were collected and they were analysed pre-COVID. Now, at one level, you think, oh, well, goodness me, does that mean it is very much help to us at all? I think it is, because what it does is it provides a benchmark immediately pre-COVID to where things were driving. And we will, in the next couple of years, be able to measure with great accuracy the trends from there that are attributable to COVID and its effects. Thank you.
That's actually very, very timely that you brought that last bit up, Sandra, because we did just get a question from our Chancellor, Mr. Bill Twaddell, who's in the audience. And he actually was interested to ask the other panellists how we thought that, that COVID-19 and this devastating pandemic had affected some of the developmental challenges we brought up. So that was a very timely answer you put there. And look, I certainly agree with your sentiments about the digital divide. I think it's the most critical developmental challenge facing the world at present. And I was particularly interested in your point that this would have been devastating 20 years ago in terms of education provision. And the sobering reality is that many people around the world, as you said, are living 20 years behind in terms of access to technology. So David, I'll move to you now. Would you agree with Sandra in regards to the perils of the digital divide? And more broadly, how does the global development agenda keep up with the extraordinary rate of change which we experience each year to ensure that as a global society, we maintain a concerted plan for action for reducing inequalities?
Okay, well, first on the digital divide with Sandra, I agree very much with what she's been saying. I think we can sort of turn that into looking at the way it's impacted on affluent people and looking on the way in which it's impacted on people who are much less well off. There's around about 500 million of us in the world who are working from home, who have nice houses, have internet connections, have laptops, have the technology, and actually, there's quite a lot of reporting saying that people are finding it's not unpleasant, or it's actually quite pleasant. They don't have to commute, their carbon footprint's down if they're worried about that, their expenses are reduced. So there's actually quite a large group of people who are finding COVID-19, as long as they haven't got the disease, is not too bad. And that's because they can connect, they can live their lives in a way through broadband. But then there's a much bigger group of people, the majority in the tropics, round about 2 billion in Africa, Asia, Latin America, who certainly haven't got access to the broadband, to the laptops, to the nice, comfortable living spaces that we've got. And the impact of COVID on them was basically to close down all of their informal work. And quite often governments, at 2 or 3 hours notice, just stop the entire informal sector from working. Well, in a country like Bangladesh, the informal sector is the biggest employer. And when you close it down, then people who have to work today to eat tonight just cannot make any living. And so that sort of digital divide and access to resources and inequality has sort of been reinforced by the arrival of COVID. It's giving greater choice because of accelerated use of IT for those who are better off, but for those who haven't got access, then it really reduces the world in which they can live. And certainly when you look at people in urban parts of the tropics, then they don't have gardens. Quite often the nearest park is about 10 kilometers away, and it's probably crowded. So they really are trapped in tiny spaces with very few opportunities. This makes it very interesting for those of us. I work on poverty a lot, and it makes relative poverty, in a way, you've got to look at it now as much as extreme poverty, because certainly if I think of a household in Bangladesh, if they don't have a mobile phone, well, yeah, extremely poor people could be improving their lives, but without a mobile phone. But if you want to engage with the world, you just have to have a mobile phone in Bangladesh. You don't know what the price of crops is if you haven't got a mobile phone. You don't know where you can get a job. You don't know what's happening with your relatives. You're just disconnected. And so the digital divide is very serious. And if one looks, there has been some progress in some parts of the world with it. Certainly the shift from laptops to mobiles has actually meant that billions more people are actually able to get access to the internet and to internet services. And if you look at sort of East Africa, it was Kenya that spearheaded the way. Then they've managed to move into mobile banking through basic mobile technology, which spreads to very poor parts of Kenya, into the arid lands, into the areas where you've got pastoralists. So there is some progress, but still the inequalities are enormous. If you go to that broader question that you were asking about whether we've got a concerted plan of action to reduce inequality, one can see a little progress, but one wouldn't want to exaggerate it. There's progress, and I think we'll talk in a minute about the Sustainable Development Goals. The UN Millennium Development Goals set in 2000 could barely mention inequality because powerful countries didn't want inequality to be what it looked at. You could only look at the very poorest people and extreme poverty. You weren't to look above that. By the time we get to 2014 and 2015, when the Sustainable Development Goals are launched, then actually Goal 10 is about reducing inequality within nations and between nations. And the world had changed sufficiently for that to not be opposed, not to be blocked out. If one looks at some of the institutional changes that have occurred, we've got Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Inoculation. And that is certainly an institution which is able to try and ensure that hopefully when we have a vaccine for COVID-19, then it will be accessible to most people in the world very quickly. It won't simply go to rich people in rich nations. And so we've had some progressive institutional change. And there are policy changes too. At Manchester, quite a lot of us have been working on social protection, and we've had a movement called Just Give Money to the Poor. But many poor countries were told they couldn't afford social protection. They couldn't afford unemployment grants or grants for poor households. But over the last 15 years, most countries have tried these, and they've been working very effectively to reduce extreme poverty and to reduce inequality. The idea of universal basic income, that governments might give every citizen a basic income, yeah, back in 2000, that was seen as crazy. Now, if you look at professional economists and you look at policymakers, they're talking about UBI as a possibility and realizing that certainly when you have a crisis like COVID, if you'd had a system for the universal basic income, you could have dealt with many of the problems and the inequalities very effectively. But I think it's very hard to look at the science on this. There are optimists who think that COVID will drive us into focusing upon global problems like inequality, like pandemics, like climate change. But there's also great resistance. And a lot of that resistance comes from wealthy nations, like my own country, the UK, like Australia, and like the USA, who are worried that if you talk about reducing inequality, it may put a brake upon the resources they control and their assets, and also wealthy people. The Zuckerbergs of the world, the Murdochs of the world, who have actually been able to keep inequality out of the news, focus people on just looking at the problems of the extreme poor, but not looking at what's happening across society. So we've still got these contesting forces, and hopefully COVID, when we look back at it in the future, will have been something that helps us realize that, yeah, we do live on one world. We have to work together.
Yeah, excellent. I think it's a fantastic sentiment to finish on there too, David. Look, to all our panelists, I think we've probably covered the digital divide pretty well there. So I'm really interested now to take the conversation on the sort of broader question that I asked David then. It was very interesting, David, to hear your thoughts. You know, you pointed out the Millennium Development Goals, the changes from the MDGs to the SDGs. That really highlights the changing world that we're in at the moment, and the development agenda simply has to keep up. So on that, Rose, I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on this. You had a long career with the United Nations, and for those in the audience who aren't aware, as David mentioned, they're the leading architects and advocates of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which form perhaps the closest we've come to a genuine plan of action in reducing certain inequalities and also achieving a more equitable and sustainable world. The SDGs are now 5 years old, Rose. Are they all becoming slightly outdated as the global landscape seems to change on a daily basis? And I'll give you an example of what I'm suggesting by outdated. The fourth Sustainable Development Goal is the guiding framework for achieving the provision of quality education to 2030. And yet there's no mention of digital equity within that goal. So I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on how you see the Sustainable Development Goals adapting to a changing developmental agenda.
Well, yes, first of all, in answering your question on are they outdated, I believe the question, the answer is no, because if you look at all the 17 goals, they are all very relevant. For example, goal number 1 is about having no poverty by 2030. There is no country in the world that can now say, well, goal number 1 is irrelevant or outdated. All those goals are outdated. As the Secretary General was emphasizing, all we have to do as a global community is now to focus more and to put more effort in making sure that we implement all these goals post-COVID, so that we can achieve the equitable world that we are aspiring to in 2030. And having said that, there has actually been some progress made in achieving some of these goals. For example, a Sustainable Development Report of the United Nations has just been released. I think it was in July. It has just been released. And according to that report, there has been a drop in global income inequality. It may have been just 2 points, but that's still something if it is translated into dollar terms. So Gini index for global inequality dropped from about 48 to about 46. The only troubling thing here is that that progress was not even. It was only in a few countries. The majority of countries did not achieve a reduction in income inequality. And the countries that achieved reduction in income inequality would be the kind of a region that David is working on. It was in the east and the southeast of Asia. Why? Because they have adopted technologies that are labor intensive, production processes that are labor intensive, and therefore creating more income generating opportunities for the masses. For those that did not achieve at all, in the developed world, they tend to be capital intensive economies. The lesson here is for all countries now to go back to the drawing board to say, okay, these goals are still relevant. And as you rightly said, the Sustainable Development Goals are the offsprings of the Millennium Development Goals. The gains that were made in the Millennium Development Goals were carried into the period of the SDGs. So I can say confidently that apart from just the income inequality on a global scale that we made progress in, there was also some progress made in some areas of inequality. For example, gender equality. Gender equality is an area where good progress has been made, especially in the public arena. You find that in politics now, we have more women in parliament. We have more women even at lower levels of administration. And Sandra, I take my hat off to you because you are really a role model for a lot of women all over the world. They see you and they say, if she could get there, I will get there. And I know what that kind of inspiration can do for somebody. Like when I joined JCU, my biggest role models were Professor Harris and Professor Courtney. They used to tell me, look here, young woman, go out there and do it. So they put me in the chambers of commerce. They put me to analyze budgets for the state government. They put me to analyze budgets for the federal government. And that's how I actually managed to get into the UN, because when they were interviewing me, I was not just an academic who didn't know anything about how government systems were working. So really, progress has been made in gender equality. Yes, you mentioned education. Quality of education is poor in most countries, especially in developing countries. And it is going to get even worse. Like Sandra said, everything now has to be online. And you find that the proportion of people who are offline in developing countries is as high as 80%. That was even before COVID. And yet now we have to work at home. Children have to study at home. You have to socialize at home. You have to access health care at home. Now, how are they coping without all this? is going to be devastating for a majority of the world's population. And I think another progress that has been made, Jack, in relation to achieving the SDGs, from my experience, is that good policies have now been put in place. Many countries, for example, I was heading social development programs that were huge, including social protection. Now, many countries have got social protection policies. The challenge is, are they going to be implemented in such a way that those who are targeted will benefit from it? There are now policies on inequality reductions in almost all member states of the United Nations. The major problem has always been in implementation, either because of lack of resources, because of lack of capacity, because of lack of data, or any other reason at all, including civil unrest and political instability. So really there is hope for the world here, that although, yes, COVID has turned everything upside down, the world is still got this resolution that we must reach there, because we are great. By we, I mean countries of the world, because this is owned by countries of the world. The reason why most countries were so upset with the structural adjustment programs was because they said the human element was missing. And so it was about, let's grow the economy, let's grow the economy. In other words, we were all about the rate of economic growth. But what about the pattern of growth? Sustainable development goals have created opportunities for countries to start looking at what is the pattern of our growth? Where is this growth coming from? If it is coming from a sector like mining, how many young people are we going to employ? This COVID alone has exposed a lot of disturbing statistics. Young people are the ones who are going to be hit the most in the labor market. Even in Australia, here we are, where we are, unemployment could be 5% for everybody else. But for them, it has actually already climbed beyond 15%. So we have to start also looking at the pattern of growth. And of course, let me close on this because we have 3 minutes each. Sustainable development goals cannot be abandoned by any country in the world, because that's a platform for partnership. For most developing countries, partnerships generate a major percentage of their national budgets.
And Rose, I think I might just jump in there. I think partnerships, it's a point that I was just about to get onto with David, but before I do, thank you so much for sharing with the audience a little bit more about your story of your career. I think it's a genuine JCU alumni story. It's what we're all about, and congratulations on a fantastic career as well. So David, I'm going to come to you here. I think it's fair to say that there's many of us around the world, as Rose mentioned, who have a genuine interest in achieving a more equitable world, and humanity has illustrated that through the Sustainable Development Goals, but also the extraordinary rise of altruism, generosity, and volunteerism over the past 100 years. And I've spent some time in India, where more than 8 people own more wealth, more power, more fortune than the other 1.3 billion Indians. So in your opinion, what do we have to do to shift the trend away from the rising inequalities that we've spoken about throughout the session?
Well, there's no easy answer. I mean, if you look at the sort of technical and the scientific analysis, we've got quite a lot of the solutions identified. But to get those implemented, the sort of issues that Rose has been talking about, then we do need political changes. And so we definitely need to think about at the universities about how to come up with the technical solutions, but then how to get those technical solutions taken forward. And I think Sandra's identified this means that we have to look for accountable governance at the national level, and we also have to look internationally at how we get more effective multilateral action. That's not easy to do at the moment because we do live in a world which has been polarizing. Some writers, some academics have written about the 1% who control global wealth, but actually it may be 0.1% of national populations which is controlling the political levers. And certainly if one looks at the work of Joe Stiglitz, who's been writing about the USA, he's shown the way that a small elite group has actually got control, as he calls it, policy capture. They can actually get lower taxes for their businesses because they basically determine what the policies about business taxes are. And we're going to have to, in a way, work out ways forward about that. We can think practically, and we can also think slightly more grandly. If we think practically, then, I think you can think about reducing your carbon footprint personally. You can think about supporting NGOs, activist groups, volunteering to contribute things. And you can think about how you engage politically. How do you talk to your member of parliament, your councillors, about the sort of world that you want, about the sorts of policies that should be pursued in your town or in your state or in your country. More grandly, then, universities are about ideas, and this is a war of ideas, and we have to encourage all our academics and all our students to engage in this war of ideas, to say, I think global inequality increasing is unacceptable. It's morally unjust, it's not fair, but it also reduces the likelihood that we will be able to live in a sustainable world, that we will be able to, that humanity will be able to continue. COVID has shown this very starkly. Climate change was showing it for everybody much more deeply. And these global problems, they're not going to go away. The next ones are queuing up for 10 or 20 years' time, as well as climate change. So we really have to think about how we can move towards these one world policies and recognize that we are all in this together. And I think that's, universities are a real comparative advantage in taking forward these ideas.
I think that's a fantastic point there too, David, about the fact that, these the rising inequalities, they hinder our ability as a species to really meet head on some of the great challenges that we've ever faced. And so I think I'll move on to Sandra now. I think when we began, you were the first panelist to speak, and I think you gave a fantastic encapsulation of where the tropics are at. And so I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts. We're the University of the Tropics, and so many of our alumni who are in the audience tonight will live, work and raise families in this part of the world. So in closing, what are some of the key challenges, but also optimistically, opportunities for creating equitable societies across our part of the world? Oh, and Sandra, you're just on mute there. I'll just get you to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. Thank you for pointing that out to me. So, as a University of the Tropics, and I think as David said quite correctly, universities have a major role to play. There's no doubt about that. I mean, what universities do is they create human capital and they create knowledge. They're catalysts for innovation. And so universities around the world have a major role to play. Part of what we learnt through the State of the Tropics project was that the vast majority of research activity which is going on in the world is on issues relevant to the tropics is not emerging from the tropics. Now, there are a range of reasons for that. So part of our concern as part of that particular international leadership group is to ensure that we are working with and for tropical communities and not on tropical communities in the manner that perhaps might have happened in the past. But I guess to step back and take your question more globally, it's plain that creating an equitable future for our part of the world, for this tropical zone, this place where very soon the majority of humankind will live, requires a number of things. And we have landscaped them now. I think David's comment about trustworthy institutions, and we need social welfare, safety, welfare, universal social safety nets, in particular health, for example, is a major issue there. We need the capacity to ensure that we can continue to build that human capacity to respond to challenges and to crises as well. We know that education in and of itself is critically important, and we know that the outcomes, for example, for women and girls in particular, has a wide-ranging impact on social, economic and environmental well-being, intergenerational impacts. And what we also know is that women's and girls' involvement in education has improved in recent years, which is a very good thing. You mentioned Muhammad Yunus before, Jack. I had the great privilege of hosting him some years ago for a major event in Brisbane. Actually, it was prior to joining JCU. And again, the idea of supporting women's enterprise is actually very, very important. And he made the point at that time that that women, it's worth backing women in these communities as well. So we have to enable women, we have to enable girls, even as boys and men are enabled to take our communities forward. You know, we have a great deal of knowledge about the tropical world. We absolutely do in tropical Australia, but well and truly beyond. And we have the opportunity in many, many ways to make a contribution to this. And even just thinking about JCU in terms of the areas in which we work, you know, if you think about what happens in tropical communities and the sort of contribution we can make, we know about delivering healthcare in rural and remote and Indigenous communities. We know about delivering distance education. We know about building cyclone-rated structures. We know about building roads and bridges in tropical environments. And we know about climate resilience agriculture, even as we're looking to maintain environmental values and protect biodiversity. We know all these things. These are not unknowable. And to my mind, it's the obligation of our university and others who have this knowledge to ensure that we're sharing this knowledge and working with and for others in terms of its dissemination, because the need is great. One of the areas that I didn't mention before, another State of the Tropics report, we've done those 2 broad brush reports, but we've also done 2 thematic reports, one on health and one on sustainable infrastructure. And Dakar, I might say, David, was one of the case studies that we looked at in that particular report. And we know that the drag on the lack of sustainable infrastructure in communities is very important. But you asked me to be upbeat about it. And as I say, I'll just remind us that we know that things are improving. It's very spotty, and I absolutely acknowledge Rose and David are so correct in saying when you drill down into particular places and particular communities, there are very many different stories being told here. But what we do know is that on balance, life is getting better in the tropics. It is getting better in the tropics. And what's more, when you think about that demographic dividend, I opened up by talking about the size of the population and the estimate being that by 2040, 2050, more than 2/3 of the world's children will live in the tropics based on current estimates. And we estimated that some years ago, and that estimate hasn't changed in this most recent report. So while that creates tremendous challenges, that is an enormous opportunity. The world's youth will be in the tropics, and that's a demographic dividend really to those communities if we can ensure that those children grow up in a place where they can live a life rich with meaning, that they can have access to good health and education and economic opportunity. And you know, the thing is that we need this to happen in no small way because of that enormous population, the weight of population and the weight of challenge but opportunity. We know that the future of the world in no small way depends on the tropics. So it's important that we bring to bear all of our knowledge and all of our capacity to make sure we are making a material difference, because the future of the world depends on it. And indeed, the rest of the world in no small way belongs to the tropics.
I think that's a fantastic way to sort of draw our session to a bit of an end now, Sandra. We are sort of running out of time. We've had some fantastic questions come through, and I think it's great that we finished on the point of that both yourself and David made of the role that universities have to play. We did have a question from Joanne about the role that not-for-profits play. I think we actually, every person in the world, every individual has a role to play in creating a more equitable and sustainable world. So thank you to the audience for all of your questions. We are running out of time, however, so we'll endeavour to get those answered perhaps in an email to you tomorrow from some of the panellists. But look, thank you to all 3 of our esteemed panellists, especially to alumni who have taken the time to give our broader alumni community a really interesting insight into the inequalities plaguing the world at present. And I mean, I've moderated a few of these panels, and I've seen the little ticker there that says how many participants we have, and sometimes we have a bit of a drop off, sometimes we have an increase. The participants have held steady the whole session, so I think it's a real credit to the conversation that our 3 panellists are able to create tonight. Look, as someone who's very passionately invested in achieving the equitable society, which we alluded to throughout the session, it truly has been a privilege to discuss the present state of the world with you and hear your very informed insights. So in wishing you all the best for the future, this concludes tonight's Conversations with Alumni panel session. I really do hope our audience enjoyed this. Our next event will be on Wednesday, the 23rd of September, and we'll be taking this conversation forward to explore some of the other big challenges that humanity faces in the form of adapting to life with artificial intelligence. Our panellists will, of course, be alumni, and we look forward to announcing them to you in due course. However, in the meantime, please stay up to date with all things JCU and alumni on our social media. And for those of you who are alumni listening, please visit our website and make sure that your details are up to date so that we can send you an invitation to our next Conversations with Alumni session. So thank you all very much for listening, and wherever you are around the world, we wish you, our JCU alumni family, many, many safe and happy returns during these trying times. Good night.